Discover the fascinating story of German prisoners of war in America who heard a jukebox for the very first time and believed the music machine was some kind of magic. In this intriguing video, learn how this small moment revealed the huge cultural gap between wartime enemies. 1944. Somewhere in the American South, the war had already taken everything familiar from them: their homes, their uniforms, their certainty about the world. Behind barbed wire fences and wooden guard towers, hundreds of German prisoners of war lived in a place that felt less like a prison and more like a mystery. They had been told America was crumbling, poor, chaotic, starving, a nation on the brink of collapse. But what they saw every day didn't match the stories. The camp had electricity, hot food, medical care, and beyond the fences, they could see farms, towns, and highways filled with cars. It didn't make sense. Most of the prisoners were young, some barely out of school when they were sent to fight. They had grown up hearing that America was weak, divided, and controlled by greedy elites, while ordinary people suffered. But from inside the camp, they watched farmers drive tractors. They saw delivery trucks bringing supplies. They saw lights glowing in houses at night. And sometimes, when work crews were assigned outside the camp, they saw something even stranger: smiles. Americans waved at them. Not all, not always, but enough to make them question everything. One Saturday afternoon, a small group of prisoners was assigned to a road maintenance detail near a rural town, guarded, watched, but allowed to work outside the fences. It was the first time many of them had been that close to everyday American life. They passed a small roadside diner, the kind with a metal exterior, wide windows, and a neon sign buzzing softly in the daylight. Inside, teenagers sat on stools. Women in dresses laughed over milkshakes. A man in a hat read a newspaper at the counter. It looked like a movie scene. Then they heard it. Music. Not from a band, not from a radio they could see. Music that sounded bright, fast, joyful. Trumpets, drums, a swinging rhythm that made people tap their feet without thinking. The prisoners slowed down, turning their heads. One of them muttered in German, "Wo kommt das her?" Where is that coming from? Through the diner window, they saw a glowing machine against the wall. Colored lights, chrome edges, glass front. A girl dropped a coin into it. There was a click, a mechanical whir, and the music grew louder. The German prisoners stopped working. Even the American guard noticed their confusion. Inside the diner, two teenagers jumped up and started dancing between the tables, laughing as the song played. The prisoners stared like they were watching something from another planet. One finally asked the guard in broken English, "Radio?" The guard shook his head. "Jukebox." They didn't understand the word. He pointed. "You put a coin in, it plays whatever song you pick." The prisoners looked back at the machine, stunned. A machine that played music on command. Not for the rich, not for officers, not in a grand theater, in a roadside diner, for anyone with a coin. One of the prisoners whispered, "Das ist Propaganda. This must be propaganda," because back home they had been told Americans struggled just to survive. That luxury was rare. That culture was shallow. But here were ordinary people, factory workers, farmers' kids, choosing songs for fun on a sunny afternoon. The guard must have seen the disbelief on their faces. After a moment, he said something unexpected. "You boys want to hear one up close?" They looked at him, unsure if they understood. He gestured toward the diner. "When we're done here, 5 minutes." The prisoners exchanged glances, suspicious. But that evening, As the sun dipped lower and the work detail wrapped up, the guard did exactly what he said. He marched them, still under watch, to the diner entrance. Conversations inside quieted as people noticed the uniforms. German prisoners. For a moment, the air was tense. Then the diner owner, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and flour on her apron, gave a small nod. Long as they behave. The guard stepped aside just enough for the prisoners to stand near the door, close enough to see, close enough to hear. One of the local boys walked up to the jukebox. "Pick one," he said to the guard with a grin. The guard looked at the prisoners. "What do you want to hear?" They didn't know any American songs, so the guard picked. A coin dropped. Buttons clicked. The record inside fell into place with a soft mechanical clunk. Then, music filled the diner again. Loud, clear, alive. The prisoners froze. They weren't hearing bombs, or marching boots, or shouted orders. They were hearing joy. Simple, ordinary joy. Bought for a coin, shared with strangers. One prisoner actually stepped closer, staring through the glass at the spinning record like it was some kind of magic trick. "Machine," he whispered. "Machine." But what shook them wasn't the technology. It was the people. No one looked afraid. No one looked hungry. No one looked oppressed the way they had been told Americans were. They looked normal, happy even. And for the first time since being captured, a dangerous thought crept into their minds. What else were we lied to about? The song ended. The room returned to the clatter of dishes and low conversation. The guard nodded. "All right, boys, back to the truck." The prisoners walked out quietly, but they didn't speak for a long time. Because that jukebox hadn't just played a song, it had cracked open the wall of propaganda they had lived behind their entire lives. And once a crack appears, it never fully closes again. That night, back in the wooden barracks, the camp felt different. Nothing had changed. The same bunks, the same thin mattresses, the same dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. But the silence wasn't the same. Usually, evenings were filled with quiet card games, letters being written home, or men staring at the walls, lost in thoughts they never said out loud. Now, there was whispering, low, urgent German voices drifting between bunks. "Did you see the lights on it?" The sound was so clear. They were dancing. In the middle of the day, one of the older prisoners, a former factory mechanic, sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. "That machine," he said quietly, "was precision made, not cheap, not improvised, mass produced." Someone across the room frowned. So he looked up. "So if a small roadside diner can afford something like that, imagine their factories." "No," one replied, because they were all thinking the same thing. Back in Germany, by 1944, cities were rubble, factories were bombed, electricity flickered on and off, food was rationed tighter every month. Yet here, thousands of miles from the front lines, civilians had music machines for entertainment. It didn't match the image they'd been given of a struggling, inferior enemy. One young prisoner, barely 18, lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. "My mother waits in line 2 hours for bread," he murmured. And here, they put coins into music. No one argued, because none of them could. Over the next weeks, work details continued. Farms, roads, warehouses, and every time they left the camp, they saw more pieces of the same puzzle. Grocery stores with full shelves, gas stations with cars coming and going, kids riding bicycles without fear of air raids. Sometimes they passed houses with windows open and music drifted out. Big band, swing, cheerful voices, singing about love and dancing. Once, a farmer's wife brought lemonade out to the field where they were working. The guard hesitated, then allowed it. She handed the cups to the prisoners like they were just tired workers, not enemy soldiers. One of them tried to refuse. She pushed it gently into his hands. "It's hot," she said simply. No anger, no hatred in her voice. That confused them more than anything. They had expected revenge, cruelty, punishment. Instead, they were met with ordinary human decency. Not everywhere, not from everyone, but enough to make their old beliefs feel shaky. Then came the second jukebox. This time, it was in a larger town. Their truck stopped near a supply depot, and across the street was a drugstore with a soda fountain inside. Through the wide front windows, they saw it again. Glowing, colorful, impossible to ignore. But this time, something else caught their attention. 2 American soldiers in uniform stood at the counter, laughing with a girl behind the register. One of the prisoners stared. "They are not at the front," he said. Another nodded slowly. "They rotate home, rest, then go back." In Germany, leave was rare by that stage of the war. Units were shattered and reformed constantly. Rest was a luxury few saw. But here were American soldiers drinking sodas, feeding coins into a jukebox, living a life that looked balanced. The contrast was painful. That evening, back in camp, a quiet shift began. It didn't happen all at once. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just small changes. Men who had once argued loudly about victory now spoke less confidently. Letters home changed tone. Less certainty, more questions. A few prisoners signed up for English classes, offered inside the camp. At first, others mocked them. "Planning to stay here?" someone joked. But more joined, because understanding the language meant understanding the people. And understanding the people meant facing the uncomfortable possibility that the world was not what they had been told. Months later, one of those same prisoners would describe the moment everything started to change. It wasn't during a battle, not during capture, not even when he first arrived in America. It was when a teenage girl dropped a coin into a jukebox and started dancing without fear. That, he said, was when I realized the war we believed in did not exist in the way we were told. Because propaganda can survive hunger. It can survive fear. It can survive distance. But it struggles to survive reality. And reality, in this case, came wrapped in chrome, glowing lights, and a 3-minute swing song playing in a roadside diner. Years passed. The war ended. Germany collapsed. Borders shifted. Cities were divided. Families searched for missing sons who would never come home. And slowly, ships began carrying former prisoners back across the Atlantic. Men who had once marched in step under Nazi banners now stood on the decks in worn coats, older than their years, watching the American coastline fade into the distance. Some felt relief. Some felt shame. Some felt something they couldn't quite name. Because they weren't just leaving a prison camp, they were leaving a version of the world that had quietly changed them. Back in Germany, the silence hit first bombed-out streets, hollow buildings with windows like empty eye sockets, train stations crowded with refugees carrying everything they owned in sacks and suitcases. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. Certainty was gone. One former POW, the same quiet mechanic who had studied the jukebox months earlier, walked through his hometown and stopped in front of what used to be a cinema. It was a pile of bricks. He stood there a long time. Then he said to no one, "In America, even the small towns had music. It wasn't envy. It was disbelief at the scale of difference. In the years that followed, stories began to surface, not official reports, not political speeches, just conversations between neighbors, co-workers, men standing in line for ration cards. You were in America, right? Yes. Was it really like they say? And at first, many hesitated, because admitting the truth felt dangerous, like betraying the version of reality they had once defended. But truth has a way of slipping out in small pieces. They had food, someone would say quietly. The guards, most were fair. We worked on farms. Families talked to us. I saw a machine that played music for coins. People would laugh at that last one until they realized he wasn't joking. One former prisoner eventually found work repairing radios in a small German town. Every time he opened the back of a set, wires and tubes exposed, he remembered the jukebox, the clarity of the sound, the polished casing, the fact that it existed not for survival, but for joy. He began fixing radios with extra care. Music matters, he told his apprentice once. The boy didn't understand the weight behind those words, but to the man who had heard swing music drifting across a Florida diner while wearing a prison uniform, it meant everything. Some of the former POWs did something even more surprising. They wrote letters, not to German officers, not to old units, to American families, farmers, shop owners, even a diner waitress in one case. Simple letters written in careful English. Thank you for the kindness. I never forgot the lemonade on that hot day. I hope your family is well. Many never knew if the letters arrived, but writing them mattered. It was a quiet way of closing a chapter that had begun with war and ended with unexpected humanity. Years later, when West Germany began rebuilding, American products started appearing in stores, records, radios, eventually televisions. And one afternoon, a middle-aged man stood in front of a shop window, staring at a record player. Music played through a small speaker. Tinny but cheerful, a crowd gathered. The man smiled to himself. We finally got our jukebox, he murmured. His wife asked what he meant. He shook his head. Just something I saw once, a long time ago. History books would talk about strategy, battles, treaties. They would list divisions and casualty numbers, but they wouldn't mention the quiet psychological turning points, the moments when an enemy soldier saw ordinary life on the other side and realized the world was bigger, more complicated, and more human than propaganda allowed. For some German prisoners, it wasn't a speech or a political debate that changed them. It was a glass of lemonade, a friendly conversation, a glowing jukebox playing a happy song in the middle of wartime. Small things. But sometimes small things are the ones that last. And in the decades that followed, those memories didn't fade. They settled quietly into everyday life. The former prisoners became fathers, grandfathers, factory workers, shop owners, bus drivers, men who rarely spoke about the war in detail, but who carried certain lessons with them, like invisible luggage. One of them never allowed his children to use the word enemy lightly. When his son came home from school, angry about another country, repeating something he'd heard on the radio, the father shook his head. Countries fight, he said. People are more complicated. He never mentioned the American farmer who had slipped him an extra apple during harvest season. But that moment was sitting right there behind his eyes. Another former POW insisted on keeping a small radio on the kitchen shelf at all times. Every Sunday morning, music played while the family ate breakfast. His daughter once asked why music seemed so important to him. He paused, then answered simply, "Because there was a time when I heard it and realized the world wasn't only war." She didn't fully understand. But she remembered the way he said it, like music had once been a doorway out of something dark. Some of the men never returned to the United States, but America stayed in their vocabulary, not in a political way, in small, oddly specific memories, wide roads, supermarkets with too many choices, strangers who made eye contact and smiled, and that unbelievable machine that played songs just because someone dropped in a coin. To their children, it sounded like exaggeration, like fairy tales from a different planet. But to the men who had stood in prison uniforms under a bright American sky, it had been real. Not every experience had been perfect. It wasn't paradise. There had been loneliness, homesickness, fear for families back in Europe, and moments of tension with guards who were tired and human too. But what stayed with many of them was this: the realization that the people they had been told to hate lived ordinary lives filled with the same routines, worries, and small joys as their own families back home. That realization didn't erase the past, but it complicated it. And sometimes that's where understanding begins. In the 1970s and 80s, a few former POWs finally spoke openly in interviews and local history projects. Their stories surprised younger generations. "You're saying Americans were kind to you?" one interviewer asked. The old man nodded slowly. "Some were, some weren't, just like anywhere," he said. Then he added, "But I learned something there. Hatred is loud. Normal life is quiet, and quiet is stronger than we think." Today, most of those men are gone. Their names are footnotes, if they're written down at all. But their memories lived on in subtle ways. In the way they raised their children to question propaganda, in the way they valued music, food, and ordinary peace, in the way they hesitated before calling anyone an enemy. And in old family photo albums across Germany, there are sometimes pictures that don't quite fit. A young German man in worn clothes standing beside an American barn. Another smiling awkwardly next to a pickup truck. No weapons. No barbed wire visible. Just sunlight and uncertain smiles. Proof that even in the middle of a global war, human moments still found a way to exist. Because in the end, the story wasn't really about jukeboxes, or hamburgers, or color televisions. It was about something much quieter. The shock of discovering that the enemy had a normal life, and the way that discovery echoed for the rest of their lives. If this story changed the way you see history even a little, you're not alone. Sometimes the biggest turning points don't happen on battlefields. They happen in diners, on farms, beside a glowing machine playing a song that reminds someone they're still human. And that's where we'll leave this story. Not on a battlefield, but in a small American diner with a coin dropping into a jukebox and a song that quietly challenged everything a young soldier thought he knew about the world. History isn't only shaped by generals and governments. Sometimes it's shaped by ordinary moments that remind people their enemies are human too. If this story surprised you, tell us in the comments what moments stood out the most. And if you want more powerful, untold human stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe to World War II Studio and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, remember, even in war, humanity can still be heard between the noise.